The last thing Tessa Greyson expected when she picked up the crystal carafe was that it would change her entire life. But then again, nobody ever expects their world to shatter at the exact moment they're trying not to get fired. The penthouse glittered like something out of a fever dream, all black marble and gold fixtures and floor-to-ceiling windows that showed downtown spread out 40 stories below like a carpet of electric stars. Tessa had worked plenty of high-end events in her 3 years waitressing, but this was different. The guests moved differently, spoke differently, held themselves with a kind of fluid grace that made her think of predators pretending to be people. Which, she'd been briefed in clipped, nervous tones by her supervisor, was exactly what they were. Vampires. Real, actual vampires. The charity banquet was being hosted by some kind of vampire aristocracy, and the catering company had been paid triple the usual rate to staff it with humans who could keep their mouths shut and their hands steady. Tessa's hands were not, at that particular moment, steady. She'd been on her feet for 11 hours already, having worked the breakfast shift at the diner before this gig, and her lower back felt like someone had replaced her vertebrae with broken glass. The carafe was heavier than she'd anticipated, full of something dark and viscous that the other servers whispered was vintage blood wine, whatever that meant. She was aiming for the table near the western windows, where a cluster of pale, elegant figures stood in conversation when her ankle simply gave out. Later, she would remember it in terrible slow motion. The twist, the stumble, the desperate overcorrection that only made things worse. The carafe tipped and the blood wine thick, garnet dark, probably worth more than her monthly rent, cascaded out in a perfect arc that ended squarely on the back and shoulder of the tallest figure in the room. The man who, she realized with a horror so complete it felt like drowning, wore a circlet of silver in his white hair. The room went silent. Not the gradual hush of a crowd noticing something amiss, but an instant, total absence of sound, as though someone had cut the audio cable to reality. The man turned. He was beautiful in the way that Arctic landscapes were beautiful, stunning, alien, and utterly inhospitable to human life. White hair fell past his shoulders, perfectly straight, framing a face of such pale, flawless symmetry that looking at it felt like staring at a sculpture. His eyes were dark, nearly black, set beneath elegant brows that were currently rising in what might have been surprise. The ruined coat white, elaborately embroidered, probably older than Tessa's great-grandmother, dripped crimson onto the marble floor. Tessa started, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. She tried again. "I'm so sorry, my ankle." She was going to be fired. Worse, she was going to be fired and possibly killed, because you didn't ruin the clothes of a vampire king, and that's what he clearly was. Everyone else in the room had taken a subtle step back, creating a circle of space around the disaster. Her manager was going to have a heart attack. She was never going to work in this city again. She might not live to see tomorrow. The vampire king looked down at his coat, then at the empty carafe in Tessa's trembling hands, then back at her face, and laughed. It wasn't a polite chuckle or a diplomatic smoothing over. It was a real laugh, deep and genuine, the kind that started in the chest and made its way out, despite whatever dignity tried to contain it. The sound of it was so unexpected, so completely wrong for the moment, that Tessa just stood there, frozen, while he brushed ineffectually at the wine soaking through the embroidered fabric. "In 400 years, he said, his voice rich with amusement, I have attended approximately 6,000 formal events. Not one of them has been interesting. Until now." Someone in the crowd made a choking sound. Tessa wasn't sure if it was her manager or one of the other vampires. The king pulled off the ruined coat with economical grace and draped it over one arm, revealing a simple black shirt underneath. He was still looking at Tessa with those depthless dark eyes, and there was something in his expression she couldn't quite parse. Not anger, which she'd expected, something else, something almost like delight? "What's your name?" he asked. Tessa Greyson." Her voice shook, but at least it was audible this time. "Tessa Greyson." He repeated it like he was tasting the syllables. Then, in a tone that was half jest and half something far more serious, he said, Would you do me the honor of accepting my hand in marriage?" The silence that followed was even more complete than before. Somewhere in the crowd, someone dropped a glass, and the crash of it seemed obscenely loud. Tessa's brain, which had been struggling to keep up with the evening's events, simply gave up. "I'm sorry. What?" "You've made this evening memorable," the king said, and now there was definitely amusement dancing in those dark eyes. "You've reminded me that perfection is, in fact, desperately dull. The least I can do is offer you a drink, a conversation, and perhaps should we find ourselves compatible, a lifetime of equally memorable moments." He was joking. He had to be joking. This was some kind of vampire humor that Tessa didn't understand, a way of diffusing the situation without making her feel worse. She should laugh, apologize again, and back away before she made things even more catastrophic. But the king extended his hand, palm up, and waited. Tessa looked at that outstretched hand, pale, long-fingered, steady, and made a decision that was probably going to haunt her. She set down the carafe on the nearest table and placed her hand in his. His skin was cool, not cold, and his fingers closed around hers with surprising gentleness. "I'm Gavril Obsidian," he said, "and you, Tessa Greyson, have just made me happier than I've been in a very long time." The next several hours passed in a blur that Tessa would later have trouble reconstructing. Gavril, the vampire king, she had to keep reminding herself, the actual king of the entire northeastern vampire dominion, kept her at his side for the rest of the evening. He introduced her to a succession of pale, elegant vampires whose names she immediately forgot, deflected their barely concealed shock with wit so dry it took her a moment to realize he was being funny, and generally treated her like she was exactly where she belonged, which she absolutely was not. Tessa had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment with her mother and 2 brothers, had worked her way through community college while waitressing, and currently had $17 in her checking account until her next paycheck cleared. She wore a catering uniform that she'd had to mend twice, and shoes that were giving her blisters. She did not belong in a penthouse full of immortal aristocrats who probably had stock portfolios older than the United States. But Gavril didn't seem to notice or care about any of that. He kept his hand at the small of her back, a light, steadying presence, and when one particularly supercilious vampire made a comment about the help, Gavril's response was so cutting that the other vampire actually flinched and retreated. "You don't have to do this," Tessa murmured during a brief moment when they were relatively alone, standing near the windows looking out at the city. "I know you were just being nice, but I'm fine. I can go back to work." Gavril turned to look at her, and in the dim light from the city below, his features looked softer, less marble-perfect and more real. "What if I wasn't being nice?" "Then you're crazy." "Entirely possible." He tilted his head, studying her. "When was the last time you laughed the way I did tonight? Really laughed, not just smiled politely because the situation called for it?" Tessa thought about it. "My little brother sent me a video of his cat last week. The cat was trying to fit into a box that was way too small. And before that, she had to think longer. I'm not sure. Gavril said quietly, cannot remember. Before tonight. I don't remember the last time something surprised me enough to make me forget the performance of being who I'm supposed to be." He looked back out at the city. "Do you know what it's like to have people watch your every move for 4 centuries? To know that any deviation from perfect, dignified composure will be noted, discussed, potentially used against you?" "No," Tessa said honestly. "I don't. But I know what it's like to be so tired you can't see straight and have to smile anyway because the customer wants you to. I know what it's like to have people look right through you because you're just the help. I know what it's like to feel like if you stop performing for even a second, everything will fall apart." Gavril was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I was 23 when I was turned. Young, arrogant, absolutely certain I knew better than everyone around me. I made mistakes, public ones, the kind that get remembered and repeated for centuries." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I learned to be perfect after that, controlled, unassailable, and I have been performing that perfection for a very, very long time." Sounds exhausting, Tessa said softly. It is. He turned back to her. You dumped wine on me, looked absolutely horrified, apologized with genuine feeling, and then looked at me like I was insane when I laughed. You didn't perform. You were just real. Do you have any idea how rare that is in my world? So you proposed marriage? Tessa tried to make it sound light, teasing, but her heart was doing complicated things in her chest. I did. Gavril's expression shifted into something that might have been a smile if sculptures could smile. And you haven't answered. Because you weren't serious. What if I was? Tessa stared at him. The thing was, he looked serious, sounded serious. And some wild, reckless part of her, the part that had moved to the city with $200 and a dream of actually making something of herself, the part that had survived bad roommates and worse boyfriends and the constant grinding anxiety of near poverty, wanted to say yes, wanted to see what would happen if she just leaned into the insanity of the evening. I don't know you, she said finally, and you don't know me. True. Gavril inclined his head. So let's fix that. Have dinner with me tomorrow. No performance, no audience, just two people having a conversation. If at the end of it you want nothing more to do with me, I'll accept that with grace. But if you find yourself even remotely intrigued... He let the sentence hang. This is crazy, Tessa said. Yes, I spilled wine on you. You did. And somehow that turned into a marriage proposal and now a dinner invitation. The heart wants what it wants, even when the heart has been beating for 400 years. Gavril said it lightly, but there was something underneath the words, something raw and real that made Tessa's breath catch. She should say no. Should thank him for his kindness, finish her shift, go home to her cramped apartment and her real life. Should not get tangled up with a vampire king who probably had a dozen complicated political situations she couldn't even imagine. Okay, she heard herself say. Dinner. One dinner. Gavril's smile, when it came, was radiant. The dinner turned into 3 dinners, which turned into late-night phone calls, which turned into Gavril showing up at the diner where Tessa worked the morning shift and sitting at the counter drinking terrible coffee while she served pancakes to truckers and students. He never seemed to mind the grease-scented air or the cracked vinyl seats or the fact that Tessa's uniform was as far from glamorous as clothing could get. He just sat there, reading a newspaper that was probably beneath his dignity, and smiled every time she refilled his cup. Your Majesty is slumming, one of her co-workers, Marcus, said after the 3rd such visit. He was a grad student, perpetually exhausted, and one of the few people at the diner Tessa actually liked. Should I be concerned? Probably, Tessa said, watching Gavril through the kitchen window. He'd worn a simple black sweater and dark jeans today, and he looked almost normal. If you didn't count the otherworldly bone structure and the way he moved like gravity was a suggestion rather than a law. I'm concerned, and I'm the one dating him. Are you dating him? Marcus asked. Because it sort of looked like he proposed at that charity thing, and the vampire community news sites have been going absolutely feral about it. Tessa nearly dropped the pot of coffee she was holding. The what now? Marcus pulled out his phone and showed her. Sure enough, there were at least a dozen articles on various websites with headlines ranging from King Gavril's shocking engagement to Human Waitress captures vampire king's heart to Royal wedding or royal scandal. Oh, God, Tessa said weakly. You didn't know? I thought he was joking, or half joking, or... She put down the coffee pot before she did drop it. We've been on 3 dates, Marcus. 3. And he never mentioned that apparently the entire vampire world thinks we're engaged. Might want to clarify that, Marcus said, eyeing Gavril, before things get more complicated. Tessa untied her apron with hands that were only shaking a little. Cover for me? Always. She slid into the booth across from Gavril, who looked up from his newspaper with evident pleasure. Finished with your shift? Not exactly. Tessa pulled out her own phone and showed him the articles. Want to explain this? Gavril glanced at the screen and something flashed across his face too quickly for her to identify. That's all you have to say? I should have mentioned it. He set down the paper and gave her his full attention. After the banquet, I didn't correct the assumption. I thought. He paused, choosing his words carefully. The court has been pressuring me to marry for decades. Politically advantageous marriages, alliances with other dominions, that sort of thing. When I made that proposal to you, half in jest or not, it gave me an excuse to deflect all of that. And perhaps I was curious to see what would happen if I simply let people believe it. You used me as a political shield, Tessa said flatly. No. Gavril's voice was sharp. Or not only that. Tessa, I meant what I said that night. You made me laugh. You made me feel something other than the endless, grinding obligation of being what everyone expects. I wanted to know you better. And yes, I also wanted to buy myself some time away from the court's machinations. But I should have told you what was happening. That was unfair. Tessa sat back in the cracked vinyl booth and tried to organize her thoughts. So the entire vampire community thinks we're engaged, but we're actually just dating? Kind of? Is that what this is? What do you want it to be? Gavril asked quietly. I don't know. Tessa rubbed her eyes. I like you. I really like you, which is terrifying because you're a 400-year-old vampire king and I'm a waitress who has $23 in my checking account. We don't make sense. Perhaps that's why we work. Do we work? She looked at him, really looked at him. Because from where I'm sitting, this feels like a fairy tale, and fairy tales don't happen to people like me. This feels like something that's going to explode in my face, and I'm going to be left picking up the pieces while you go back to your actual life. Gavril was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the diner hummed with mundane life. The hiss of the griddle, the clink of silverware, someone's country music ringtone going off. Finally, he said, when I was turned, it was not by choice. I was dying of a wound taken in a skirmish I should never have been part of, and someone decided I was worth saving. I woke up different, powerful, immortal. And I was glad at first. I thought I'd been given a gift. He picked up his coffee cup, turned it in his hands. But immortality comes with a cost. Everyone you love dies. Everything you build eventually crumbles. You learn to hold yourself apart, to not invest too deeply, because what's the point? It all ends anyway. And then the years pile up, and you realize you've become something cold and distant, and you can't quite remember who you were before. Tessa's throat felt tight. You, Gavril continued, looking directly at her with those fathomless dark eyes, make me feel like the person I was at 23, reckless and hopeful and willing to believe in things that don't make logical sense. And maybe this will explode, and maybe we're a terrible idea, but I would rather have this, whatever this is, than another 400 years of perfect, lonely dignity. That's not fair, Tessa said, and her voice came out rough. You can't just say things like that. Why not? Because it makes me want to say yes to things I know I should say no to. Gavril set down the coffee cup and reached across the table, palm up, the same way he had at the banquet. An invitation, not a demand. Then say yes. Let's make this real. Not a joke, not a political game, but an actual engagement. We'll figure out the rest as we go. You're insane, Tessa whispered. Probably. He waited, hand still extended. Tessa thought about her cramped apartment, her maxed-out credit cards, her mother's voice on the phone last week saying she was worried Tessa was working too hard. She thought about the careful, narrow life she'd built for herself. The one that was safe and practical and slowly suffocating her. She thought about Gavril's laugh that first night, the way he looked at her like she was something precious and surprising. She put her hand in his. Okay, she said, let's be insane together. The announcement was made official 3 days later, and the vampire world collectively lost its mind. Gavril's penthouse, which Tessa had visited twice more since that conversation in the diner, was suddenly under siege by journalists, courtiers, and what Gavril called concerned parties, which seemed to be code for people who think this is a terrible idea and want to say so loudly. He handled it all with the same unflappable grace he brought to everything, but Tessa could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, the way his smiles were a fraction of a second slower when they were in public. You don't have to do this, she told him after a particularly brutal session with his advisors, who had made their opinions on human vampire marriages very clear. I know this is making your life harder. They were in his study, a room full of old books and older furniture, and Gavril was standing at the window looking out at the evening city. He'd taken off his jacket and rolled up his sleeves, a concession to privacy that made him look younger, more approachable. My life has been hard in a variety of ways for 4 centuries, he said without turning around. This particular hardship comes with compensations. Such as... He turned then, and the look he gave her was warm enough to make her forget, for a moment, that he was technically a predator. You, here, telling me I don't have to fight battles I've chosen to fight. It's refreshing. Tessa crossed the room to stand beside him. Up close, she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the only sign of expression on that perfect face. I just don't want you to wake up in a month and regret this. I won't. Gavril said it with utter certainty. Then, more softly, but I worry you will. This world I'm bringing you into, it's not kind. The court politics, the ancient grudges, the fact that you'll always be seen as lesser by some of them simply because you're human. I can protect you from many things, but not from all of it. I'm tougher than I look, Tessa said. I know. He brushed a strand of hair back from her face, his cool fingers gentle against her skin. You work 2 jobs, you send money home to your mother, you smile at customers who treat you like you're invisible. You've been fighting battles your whole life. I just wish I could make it so you didn't have to fight this one. Something in Tessa's chest cracked open. Nobody had ever said anything like that to her before. Nobody had ever looked at her life and seen the struggle of it, the constant effort required just to stay afloat. Gavril. He kissed her before she could finish the sentence. It was gentle, almost tentative, like he was afraid she might pull away. Tessa, who had been thinking about kissing him since approximately their second dinner together, made a small sound and leaned into it, her hands coming up to rest against his chest. Gavril's arms came around her, pulling her closer, and the kiss deepened into something that felt like a promise. He was cool everywhere they touched, but not unpleasantly so, and there was a controlled strength in the way he held her that made her feel both safe and desired. When they finally broke apart, Tessa was breathing hard, and Gavril's eyes had gone darker, the pupils blown wide. I should probably mention, he said, his voice rougher than usual, that I'm falling in love with you, in case that wasn't clear. Tessa laughed, the sound bubbling up from somewhere deep in her chest. It was pretty clear, and for the record, the feeling's mutual. Good. Gavril rested his forehead against hers. Because I'm about to ask you to attend a formal court gathering with me, and it would be deeply awkward if you didn't actually like me. How formal are we talking? Very. Ancient protocols, elaborate outfits, several hours of standing around looking dignified while people either congratulate or subtly insult us. Sounds like a nightmare. It will be. Gavril pulled back just enough to meet her eyes. But you'll be brilliant and I'll be there, and afterwards we can escape and do something significantly less tedious. Is that a promise? Absolutely. The court gathering was, in fact, a nightmare, but not for the reasons Tessa had anticipated. The dress Gavril had sent over was beautiful deep emerald silk that fit her perfectly and probably cost more than 3 months of her rent, and the stylist who'd shown up at her apartment had done something miraculous with her hair. Tessa had looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the elegant woman staring back. But all the preparation in the world couldn't change the fact that she was walking into a room full of immortal aristocrats who had made it very clear they thought this engagement was somewhere between a joke and an insult. Gavril met her at the entrance to the hall, and his expression when he saw her made the whole ordeal almost worthwhile. "You're stunning," he said simply, and offered his arm. The hall was underground, hidden beneath what looked like an ordinary office building downtown, and it was vast. Vaulted ceilings, chandeliers that dripped crystal, marble floors polished to a mirror shine. The vampires assembled there were uniformly pale and beautiful, dressed in clothes that ranged from historically accurate period pieces to cutting-edge modern fashion. They turned as one when Tessa and Gavril entered, and the weight of their collective attention was almost physical. "Smile," Gavril murmured, "and remember, You have absolutely nothing to prove to any of them." Tessa smiled, mostly because the alternative was running, and let Gavril guide her into the lion's den. The first hour was bearable. Gavril introduced her to a succession of vampires' nobility, elders, representatives from other dominions, and most of them were at least superficially polite. Tessa answered questions about her work, her family, her education, and tried not to feel like she was being assessed and found wanting. But then they encountered a tall, elegant vampire with white hair, braided intricately down her back and eyes like chips of ice. She looked at Tessa the way someone might look at an interesting insect, and her smile was all teeth. "So this is the human," she said to Gavril, as though Tessa weren't standing right there. "The waitress who inspired such sudden devotion." "Tessa Greyson," Gavril said, his voice cool and even. "May I present Seraphine Thornheart, head of the Eastern Council." "A pleasure," Tessa said, because what else was she supposed to say? Seraphine's smile sharpened. "I'm sure. Tell me, Miss Greyson, how does it feel to have caught the king's attention with such a fortuitous accident?" "Spilling wine, I believe." "Such a clever strategy. One might almost call it calculated." The implication was clear and deeply insulting. Tessa felt Gavril go very still beside her, a predator poised to strike, but she put a hand on his arm. This was her fight. "It feels embarrassing, actually," she said evenly. "I ruined a coat that was probably worth more than everything I own, and I spent the rest of that night convinced I was going to be fired and possibly killed. The only thing that was calculated was my attempt not to burst into tears in front of a room full of strangers." "And yet here you are," Seraphine said. "Engaged to the king. What a remarkable recovery." "I'm a waitress," Tessa said. "I recover from disasters for a living. It's kind of the job description." Someone nearby made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Seraphine's expression went cold. "How charming. I do hope you'll forgive my concern, Miss Greyson. It's simply that the king has responsibilities to his people, to the court, to the continuation of our civilization. A human bride offers none of the political advantages that an appropriate match might provide. One wonders what exactly you bring to this arrangement beyond a certain novelty value." The words hit like a slap, partially because they echoed Tessa's own deepest fears. What did she bring to this? She wasn't powerful, wasn't wealthy, wasn't even particularly special. She was ordinary in every way that seemed to matter here. But before she could formulate a response, Gavril spoke, and his voice was colder than Tessa had ever heard it. "Seraphine, you will apologize to my fiancé, or you will leave this gathering. Those are your options." The room went silent. Seraphine's eyes widened fractionally. "Your Majesty, I meant no disrespect." "You meant absolute disrespect, and we both know it." Gavril's tone didn't rise, but it cut like a blade. "Tessa brings honesty, warmth, and genuine feeling to my life. She makes me want to be better than the cold, political creature you and the rest of the court have tried to shape me into. If you cannot see the value in that, then you are more limited than I gave you credit for." Seraphine looked like she'd been struck. For a long moment she didn't move. Then stiffly, "My apologies, Miss Greyson. I spoke out of turn." "Apology accepted," Tessa said, because what else could she do? Seraphine turned and walked away, her posture rigid with suppressed fury. "That's going to cause problems," Tessa said quietly. "Undoubtedly." Gavril looked down at her, and some of the coldness had left his expression. "Are you all right?" "I've had worse from customers who didn't like their eggs." Tessa tried to smile, but it felt shaky. "Although usually they don't question my entire worth as a person." "You're worth 1,000 of them," Gavril said fiercely. "Don't ever doubt that." Tessa wanted to believe him. She really did. But as the evening wore on and she caught the sidelong looks, the whispered conversations that stopped when she got too close, she couldn't shake the feeling that Seraphine had simply said out loud what everyone else was thinking. The explosion came 2 weeks later, and it came from an unexpected direction. Tessa was at Gavril's penthouse, curled up on the obscenely comfortable sofa in his study while he dealt with paperwork at his desk. It had become their routine. She'd come over after her shifts, and they'd exist in companionable silence, occasionally talking but mostly just enjoying each other's presence. It was domestic and lovely, and made Tessa's heart ache with how much she wanted this to last. Gavril's phone rang, a sharp trill that shattered the quiet. He glanced at the screen, frowned, and answered. Lucienne, this is unexpected. Tessa couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but she could see Gavril's expression shifting from mild curiosity to carefully controlled anger. I see, he said finally. And you felt this was information I should have immediately? More talking from the other end. Gavril's jaw tightened. No, absolutely not. I don't care what evidence you think you have, I'm not. He stopped, listening. Then, send it to me. I'll review it and contact you tomorrow. He hung up and sat very still for a moment, staring at his phone like it had personally offended him. What's wrong? Tessa asked. Gavril looked up at her, and there was something raw in his expression. Lucian is an old friend. He's also unfortunately observant and well-connected in court politics. He set down the phone with deliberate care. He just informed me that Seraphine has been spreading a rather specific rumor. What kind of rumor? That our engagement is a sham. That I proposed as a joke to embarrass the court, and that you're complicit in maintaining the fiction because you're being paid. Tessa's stomach dropped. What? She's claiming to have evidence that I've transferred significant funds to your accounts, which I have, because I didn't want you to have to work yourself to exhaustion while planning a wedding. Gavril's voice was tight with controlled fury. And she's using the fact that the proposal happened so suddenly, so publicly, to suggest that the entire thing was orchestrated to make the court look foolish for taking it seriously. But that's... Tessa stopped. Because it wasn't entirely wrong, was it? The proposal had been sudden, had been half a joke, and Gavril had admitted that he'd used it to deflect political pressure. The fact that it had become real didn't change how it had started. It's a distortion of the truth, Gavril said, clearly following her thoughts. But it's a believable one, and in court politics, believability is all that matters. So what do we do? Gavril stood and crossed to where she sat, kneeling in front of the sofa so they were eye level. We tell the truth. We make a statement together, explaining exactly how this began and how it evolved into something real. We present a united front, and we dare anyone to call us liars. Will that work? I don't know. He took her hands in his. But I know I'm not going to let Seraphine destroy this because she's offended that I chose love over political advantage. Tessa's breath caught. You love me. I told you I was falling in love with you 2 weeks ago, Gavril said, a faint smile touching his lips. I've since landed, completely and irrevocably. Tessa, you're the best thing that's happened to me in centuries. I'm not giving that up without a fight. I love you too, Tessa whispered. Even though this is absolutely insane and probably going to end badly. It's not going to end badly. Gavril's voice was firm. I won't allow it. But the situation deteriorated faster than either of them could have anticipated. The rumors spread through the vampire community like wildfire, and within 3 days, Gavril was facing calls from the council to dissolve the engagement and formally apologize for what they termed disrespect to the court's dignity. Tessa watched him handle call after call, meeting after meeting, and saw the toll it was taking. The easy warmth between them was still there, but it was strained under the weight of constant scrutiny and conflict. She started to wonder if Seraphine had been right. Not about the sham, that part was a lie, but about the rest of it. What did she bring to Gavril's life except complication and political disaster? You're thinking too loud, Gavril said one evening. They were having dinner in his penthouse, a quiet meal that was supposed to be a break from the chaos. I can practically hear the gears turning. I'm just thinking that maybe this isn't worth it, Tessa said quietly. All this fighting, all this damage to your reputation. For what? So you can be with a human waitress who doesn't understand your world and can't offer you anything useful? Gavril set down his fork with a click. Don't. Don't what? Don't let them win by convincing you that you're not enough. His eyes were fierce. That's what this is about, Tessa. Seraphine and the others like her, they want you to believe you're worthless, so you'll remove yourself from the equation. Don't give them that satisfaction. But what if they're right? Tessa's voice broke. Not about the sham, but about the rest. I can't give you political alliances or immortal heirs or any of the things a vampire king should have in a partner. I'm just me, and maybe that's not enough." Gavril stood, walked around the table, and pulled her to her feet. His hands framed her face, cool and steady. "You are everything. You make me laugh. You challenge me. You see me as a person instead of a title or a political tool. You've given me back pieces of myself I thought were lost forever. How is that not enough?" "Because it's not practical," Tessa said, even as tears started to slide down her cheeks. "Because love isn't enough when you're a king with responsibilities, and I'm nobody." "You're not nobody." Gavril's voice was sharp. "And I am so tired of people acting like I don't know my own mind, my own heart. I'm 400 years old, Tessa. I've had plenty of time to figure out what I want, and what I want is you. Not a political alliance in human skin. You. Even if it costs you your throne." Gavril went very still. Then, slowly, "Is that what you think is at stake? I don't know. Is it?" He let out a long breath and pulled her into his arms, tucking her head under his chin. "The council can make noise, but they can't actually remove me without cause, and falling in love isn't cause. The worst they can do is make things difficult, and they were already doing that before I met you." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I'm not losing you over political theater. We just need to weather the storm." Tessa wanted to believe him, but the storm felt like it was getting worse, not better. The breaking point came at another court gathering, this one specifically called to address concerns about the royal engagement. Tessa had wanted to stay home, but Gavril had insisted they face this together, and so she found herself back in that underground hall, wearing another beautiful dress and feeling like a fraud. Seraphine stood at the center of the room, flanked by several other council members, and her expression was triumphant. "Your Majesty," she said, "we are here today because the court has a right to understand the nature of your engagement to Miss Greyson. Specifically, we would like clarification on the circumstances of the proposal." Gavril stood beside Tessa, his posture relaxed but his voice hard. "I proposed to Tessa Greyson because she made me genuinely happy for the first time in longer than I care to remember. The circumstances were unusual, yes, but the feeling was real." "Was it?" Seraphine tilted her head. "Because witnesses report that you laughed when she spilled wine on you, that you made the proposal in a tone of jest, that you yourself called it a joke." "I called it half a jest," Gavril corrected, "and the half that wasn't jest has since grown into full commitment." "How convenient." Seraphine's smile was razor sharp. "And the substantial financial transfers to Miss Greyson's accounts? Were those also born of commitment?" "I gave Tessa money because she was working herself into exhaustion and I could afford to help. It's called caring for someone. Or compensating someone for maintaining a fiction." Seraphine turned to address the assembled court. "I put forth that this engagement began as the king's private joke, possibly at our expense, and has been maintained because dissolving it would be embarrassing. I further suggest that Miss Greyson has financial incentive to continue the charade. Under these circumstances, I move that the engagement be declared invalid and that His Majesty select a bride appropriate to his station." The room erupted in murmurs. Tessa felt like she'd been punched. Beside her, Gavril had gone absolutely rigid, a statue carved from ice and fury. "You overstep," he said, and his voice cut through the noise like a knife. "Dramatically." "I act in the court's best interest," Seraphine countered. "If this engagement is genuine, prove it. But you can't, can you? Because it began as a performance, and you've simply continued performing." Tessa's hands were shaking. This was it, the moment where everything fell apart. And maybe that was for the best. Maybe she should just walk away. Let Gavril find someone appropriate. Stop dragging him through this nightmare. But then Gavril spoke, and his words stopped her heart. "You want proof?" he said quietly. "Fine, I'll give you proof." He turned to Tessa, took both her hands in his, and sank to one knee. The room went silent. "Tessa Greyson," Gavril said, looking up at her with those fathomless dark eyes. When I met you, I was living a life of perfect hollow dignity. I had forgotten what it felt like to be surprised, to laugh with genuine delight, to look forward to tomorrow because someone I cared about would be in it. You gave all of that back to me." His voice was steady, but Tessa could feel the faint tremor in his hands. "I proposed to you the first night we met because something in me recognized something in you, and I didn't want to let it slip away. I asked you to make it real because every moment with you confirmed that initial instinct, and I'm asking you now, in front of all these witnesses, to marry me. Not because it's politically advantageous, not as a performance, but because I love you and I want to spend whatever time we have together." Tessa was crying, tears streaming down her face, and she didn't care who saw. "Gavril, I know this world is hard," he continued. "I know the court will never fully accept you, and I know you didn't ask for any of this, but I'm asking you to choose it anyway. Choose me, choose us, and I promise I will spend every day proving that you made the right decision." The room was so quiet Tessa could hear her own heartbeat. She looked down at Gavril the Vampire King, 4 centuries old, kneeling before her in a room full of his peers, and knew that this was the moment. The one where she either committed completely or walked away. She thought about her small, safe life, the one where she worked 2 jobs and sent money home and never took risks because she couldn't afford to. The one where she was slowly suffocating under the weight of just surviving. And then she thought about Gavril's laugh that first night. The way he looked at her like she was precious. The quiet evenings in his study. The conversations that stretched past midnight. The feeling of being seen, really seen for the first time in her life. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, I'll marry you." Gavril stood and kissed her, right there in front of everyone, and Tessa kissed him back with everything she had. When they finally broke apart, the room was still silent, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer hostile. It was stunned. Gavril turned to face Seraphine, keeping one arm around Tessa. "Does that suffice as proof, or would you like me to produce additional documentation of my feelings?" Seraphine looked like she'd swallowed something bitter. "That won't be necessary, Your Majesty." "Excellent." Gavril's voice was all cold politeness. "Then I trust we can consider this matter settled. The engagement is real. It will proceed, and anyone who wishes to question it further can bring their concerns directly to me. Are we clear?" There was a murmur of assent from the assembled vampires. Seraphine inclined her head stiffly and retreated into the crowd. Tessa let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Did we just win?" "I think so," Gavril said. Then, more quietly, "Are you all right? That was rather public." "I'm—" Tessa laughed, the sound a little hysterical. "I have no idea what I am. Ask me again in an hour." "Fair enough." Gavril pressed a kiss to her temple. "Let's get out of here." They left the hall to a mix of stares and whispers, but Tessa didn't care. She'd made her choice. Now she just had to figure out how to live with it. The weeks following the second proposal were strange. The court, having been presented with undeniable evidence of Gavril's commitment, grudgingly accepted the engagement as legitimate. Seraphine remained coldly polite but stopped openly campaigning against it. Other vampires who had been skeptical warmed slightly, or at least stopped making cutting remarks to Tessa's face. But the underlying tension remained. Tessa was human, mortal, an outsider in a world of immortals. And no public declaration of love could change the basic mathematics of that situation. It was Gavril who brought it up, late one night when they were lying together in his bed, the city lights filtering through the windows. "I need to ask you something," he said, his fingers tracing absent patterns on her shoulder. "And I need you to answer honestly, without worrying about what I want to hear." Tessa's stomach tightened. "Okay. Have you thought about what happens after the wedding? Long term, I mean." "In what sense?" Gavril was quiet for a moment. "In the sense that you're human and I'm not. In the sense that you'll age and I won't. In the sense that even if we have 50 years together, which is far from guaranteed, I'll still have centuries after you're gone." Tessa had thought about it, of course. had thought about it late at night when she couldn't sleep, had thought about it every time she caught sight of Gavril's ageless face and was reminded that time meant different things to them. "Yes," she said quietly, "I've thought about it. And it terrifies me. Not the dying part, everyone dies eventually, but the idea of leaving you alone, of you having to go on without me for hundreds of years, of becoming just another memory in a very long life." She stopped, her throat tight. Gavril pulled her closer. "You would never be just another memory. You'd be the memory, the one I measured everything else against. That's not better, Gavril. That's worse. That's you being alone for centuries with only ghosts for company. So what's the alternative?" His voice was very gentle. Tessa knew what he was asking, knew what he was offering, even though he hadn't said it directly. "You want to turn me. I want you to have the choice." Gavril shifted so he could look at her. "I won't pressure you, and I won't be angry if you say no. But yes, the option exists. You could become what I am. We could have centuries instead of decades. And I'd have to drink blood and avoid sunlight and give up being human." "Yes." Tessa sat up, pulling the sheet around herself. "I need to think about it." "Of course." Gavril sat up beside her, his pale hair falling over his shoulders. "Take all the time you need. This isn't a decision to make lightly. Would you—" Tessa stopped, started again. "Would you want me to, be honest?" Gavril considered the question seriously. "I want you to be happy. If being human makes you happy, then I want you to stay human, and I'll cherish every year we have. If becoming a vampire would make you happy, then I want that for you. My own desires are complicated." "Complicated how?" "I would love to have centuries with you. I would love to not spend every moment we're apart worrying that something might happen to you, that your mortal fragility might take you from me. But I also know the cost of immortality, and I wouldn't wish that burden on you unless you actively wanted it." Tessa leaned against his shoulder. "This is a lot." "It is." He wrapped an arm around her. "Which is why I'm not asking for an answer now, just asking you to think about it." "I will," Tessa promised. She did think about it. Thought about it while serving coffee at the diner, thought about it while falling asleep, thought about it during the interminable wedding planning meetings that Gavril's staff kept scheduling. The question followed her everywhere. Did she want to become a vampire? There were obvious benefits: immortality, power, the ability to stay with Gavril without the constant ticking clock of mortality hanging over them. She'd never have to worry about money again, never have to work herself to exhaustion just to make rent. But there were costs, too. She'd have to give up sunlight, give up normal food, give up any chance of a conventional life. She'd outlive everyone she knew, her mother, her brothers, her friends. She'd become something other, something that existed in the shadows. It was Marcus who finally helped her work through it. They were closing up the diner one night, and Tessa was unusually quiet as she wiped down tables. "Okay, spill," Marcus said, putting away the last of the clean mugs. "You've been weird all week. Is it wedding jitters?" "Sort of." Tessa set down her rag. "Gavril asked if I wanted to be turned after the wedding, and I don't know what to say." Marcus let out a low whistle. "That's a big question. Right? Do you want to?" "I don't know." Tessa threw up her hands. "Part of me thinks yes, obviously, because then we could be together forever, and I wouldn't have to worry about getting old or sick or any of that. But part of me thinks I'd be giving up everything that makes me who I am." "Would you be, though?" Marcus leaned against the counter. "Giving up who you are, I mean. You'd still be Tessa. Just Tessa with fangs and a serious sun allergy. It's more than that." "Is it?" Marcus tilted his head. "Tessa, I've known you for 3 years. You're kind, you're stubborn, you work way too hard, and you have this thing where you always put everyone else first. Would becoming a vampire change any of that?" "I don't know." "I think you do know. You're scared it would change you, but you're also scared it wouldn't, and then you'd have no excuse for not taking the leap." Marcus's voice was gentle. "Look, I can't tell you what to do, but I can tell you that in the time you've been with Gavril, you've been happier than I've ever seen you. If becoming a vampire means more of that happiness, Maybe it's worth the cost. Tessa thought about that conversation for days, and slowly, quietly, she started to realize that her hesitation wasn't really about the practical concerns. It was about worthiness. Some deep part of her still believed that she didn't deserve the life Gavril was offering, that immortality and power and eternal love were things that happened to other people, not struggling waitresses from nowhere. But Gavril had chosen her, had knelt in front of his entire court and chosen her. Maybe it was time to choose him back, with everything that entailed. She told him on a quiet evening, curled up together in his study with rain pattering against the windows. "I want to be turned," she said without preamble. "After the wedding. I want to do this with you." Gavril went very still. "Are you sure?" "No," Tessa admitted. "I'm terrified, but I'm also sure that I want centuries with you more than I want to stay safely human. I want to see what we can build together. I want forever." Gavril kissed her, deep and thorough, and when he pulled back, his eyes were bright. "You'll be magnificent," he said. "An absolutely magnificent vampire. I'm going to hold you to that when I'm panicking about not being able to have coffee anymore. We have blood coffee. It's terrible, but it exists." Tessa laughed and kissed him again. "I love you. I love you too." Gavril's voice was rough with emotion, more than I thought possible. The wedding was planned for the autumn, a small ceremony by vampire standards, but still far more elaborate than anything Tessa had imagined for herself. The venue was another underground hall, this one even more beautiful than the court chamber, with walls of white stone and flowers everywhere, night-blooming jasmine and moonflowers and other blossoms that thrived in darkness. Tessa's mother and brothers came in from out of state, bewildered but trying their best to be supportive. Her mother took one look at Gavril and whispered, "He's very pale, honey. Is he anemic?" "Something like that, Mom," Tessa said, and left it at that. Her family didn't know about vampires, and she'd decided to keep it that way until after the turning. Some conversations were too complicated for pre-wedding stress. Marcus was there, dressed in an actual suit and looking uncomfortable, but pleased. A handful of Tessa's other friends had come, the ones she trusted to be discreet, and they mingled awkwardly with the vampire guests in a way that would have been funny if Tessa weren't so nervous. The ceremony itself was a blur. Gavril stood at the altar in formal black, his white hair loose around his shoulders, and when Tessa walked down the aisle, she saw his expression shift into something so openly loving that she almost started crying right then. The vows were traditional, with a few modifications for the whole immortal-mortal situation. Gavril promised to love and protect her for all the days of your life and beyond. Tessa promised to love and stand beside him in whatever form that takes. The officiant, an ancient vampire with kind eyes, smiled at that and pronounced them married. The kiss was chaste by their standards, appropriate for public consumption, but Tessa felt it all the way to her toes. The reception was less formal, though still elaborate. There was food for the human guests and blood wine for the vampires, and music that shifted between classical and modern. Tessa danced with Gavril, then with her brothers, then with Marcus, who told her she looked happy and to stop being nervous about the turning. "It's going to be fine," he said. "You're going to be a terrifying vampire queen, and I'm going to be able to say I knew you when you were still worried about making rent." "You're a good friend," Tessa said, hugging him tight. "I know. Don't forget about me when you're immortal and powerful." "Never." Late in the evening, when most of the guests had either left or clustered in small conversational groups, Seraphine approached Tessa. The vampire looked as cold and elegant as always, but there was something different in her expression. "Miss Greyson, or I suppose I should say Your Majesty now." Seraphine's tone was cool, but not hostile. "I wanted to offer my congratulations." "Thank you," Tessa said cautiously. Seraphine was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was lower. "I owe you an apology. A real one, not the political necessity I offered before." Tessa blinked. "I wasn't expecting that." "I'm sure." Seraphine's lips quirked in something that might have been a smile. "I fought against your engagement because I believed it was a mistake. that Gavril was acting out of impulse rather than wisdom. I was wrong. Was you? Yes. Seraphine looked over at where Gavril stood talking with Lucian and several other vampires. I've known him for 200 years, and I've never seen him look the way he looks at you. Whatever this is, it's real and it's good for him, which means, I suppose, that it's good for all of us. She turned back to Tessa. I heard you'll be turning. After the honeymoon, yes. Good. You'll make a better queen as one of us. Seraphine inclined her head. Welcome to the family. Your Majesty, I suspect you'll surprise us all. She walked away before Tessa could respond, leaving Tessa standing there, slightly stunned. Did Seraphine just apologize to you? Gavril appeared at her elbow, slipping an arm around her waist. I think so. I'm still processing. Miracles do happen. Gavril pressed a kiss to her temple. Ready to leave? We have a honeymoon to start. Where are we going? Somewhere with very little sunlight, excellent accommodations, and absolutely no court politics. I'll tell you the specifics on the way. Tessa leaned into him, feeling the cool solidity of his presence, the steady strength that had become her anchor. Let's go. The honeymoon was 3 weeks in Iceland, where the late autumn darkness suited Gavril perfectly and the dramatic landscapes took Tessa's breath away. They hiked across volcanic fields, soaked in hot springs under the northern lights, and spent long hours in their rented cottage doing things that had nothing to do with sightseeing. It was perfect. It was also, Tessa knew, a brief respite before everything changed. The turning was scheduled for their first night back. Gavril had arranged everything carefully, a private room in his penthouse, medical staff on standby in case anything went wrong, and a plan for the 3 days of transformation that Tessa would need to complete the change. Are you frightened? Gavril asked her as they prepared. They were in his bedroom, the curtains drawn against the morning light. Yes, Tessa said honestly, but I'm also ready. I want this. I want us. Gavril took her hands. It will hurt. I won't lie to you about that. The venom rewriting your system is intense, but I'll be here the entire time, and when you wake up, you'll be magnificent. You keep saying that, because it's true. He cupped her face in his hands. You're already magnificent. This just makes it official. Tessa kissed him, trying to pour all her love and trust and nervousness into it. When they broke apart, she said, Okay, I'm ready. Gavril guided her to the bed, settling her against the pillows. Last chance to change your mind. Not changing it. Tessa tilted her head, exposing her throat. Do it. The bite, when it came, was sharp and cold. Tessa gasped, her hands fisting in the sheets, and then the venom hit her bloodstream, and the pain started. Gavril hadn't lied. It was intense, a burning that spread from the bite outward, rewriting everything it touched. Tessa heard herself making sounds, gasps, whimpers, maybe screams. She wasn't sure, and through it all, Gavril's voice, steady and calm, telling her she was doing well, that she was strong, that he loved her. Time became meaningless. There was only pain, and Gavril's voice, and the sensation of her body tearing itself apart and rebuilding into something new. And then, after what felt like both an eternity and an instant, the pain receded. Tessa opened her eyes. The world was different. Colors were sharper. Sounds were clearer, and she could hear things she'd never noticed before. The hum of electricity in the walls, the rush of traffic 40 stories below, Gavril's breathing beside her. Gavril's breathing. She could hear his heartbeat too, slow and steady, and the rush of blood through his veins. It should have been disturbing, but instead it was fascinating. Tessa, Gavril's voice was cautious. How do you feel? Tessa sat up, testing her new body. Everything felt different, stronger, faster, more. She looked at her hands and saw that her skin had paled to match Gavril's, the warm brown she'd been born with, now a cool ivory. When she caught sight of herself in the mirror across the room, she barely recognized her reflection. Same features, but sharper somehow, more defined. And her eyes had gone dark, nearly black. I feel... She searched for the right word. Everything. Gavril's smile was brilliant. Welcome to immortality. The adjustment period was strange. Tessa had to learn to control her new strength, her new speed, the enhanced senses that threatened to overwhelm her if she didn't focus. She had to learn to hunt, which was awkward and uncomfortable until Gavril explained the blood banks and donor programs that made it possible to be a vampire without being a monster. "We're not what the movies make us out to be," he told her as they sat together in his study, now their study. "We can be civilized. We can choose to do no harm. And if I accidentally hurt someone while I'm learning control, you won't. I'll make sure of it." Gavril's confidence was absolute. "Besides, you're already doing remarkably well. Most new vampires take weeks to manage basic coordination. You're walking around after 3 days. "Perks of being stubborn," Tessa said. "Perks of being magnificent," Gavril corrected. The court's reception to vampire Tessa was notably warmer than their reception to human Tessa had been. She was one of them now, and while some vampires still looked down on her for being newly turned, the open hostility was gone. Even Seraphine seemed cautiously approving. "You carry yourself well," she told Tessa at a gathering several weeks after the turning. "Better than many who were born to this." "I had a good teacher," Tessa said, glancing at Gavril, who was across the room in conversation with Lucien. "Yes, well?" Seraphine's expression was unreadable. "The king is many things, but patient instructor hasn't traditionally been one of them. You bring out interesting qualities in him." "Is that a compliment?" "From me?" "Absolutely." Seraphine inclined her head. "You're good for him, Your Majesty. And, I'm beginning to think, good for the rest of us as well. You have a perspective we've lacked." Tessa thought about that as she settled into her new life. She'd been afraid that becoming a vampire would mean giving up who she was, but if anything, it had clarified it. She was still the person who noticed when others were struggling, still the person who thought about fairness and kindness. She just had more power to act on those instincts now, which led to her first major project as Vampire Queen. 6 months after her turning, Tessa organized a gathering that scandalized half the court and delighted the other half. Instead of another formal banquet in an underground hall, she rented out a restaurant, a normal, above-ground establishment that stayed open late and invited not just vampire nobility, but the humans who worked for them. Assistants, housekeepers, drivers, and yes, catering staff. "You want to throw a party where waitresses are guests instead of servants," Gavril said when she explained the plan. He was trying not to smile and failing. "I want to throw a party where we acknowledge that the people who make our lives run smoothly are people, not furniture," Tessa corrected. "And I want to do it somewhere normal, somewhere that doesn't feel like we're hiding." "The court is going to lose their minds." "Good. They could use the excitement." Tessa looked at him. "Will you support this?" "Absolutely." Gavril pulled her into his arms. "I told you you'd be magnificent. This is exactly what I meant." The party was, by all accounts, a roaring success. The humans invited were initially nervous, but Tessa made a point of talking to each of them, learning their names and their stories, and gradually the atmosphere relaxed into something genuinely warm. The vampires who attended, mostly the younger ones and those who'd supported Tessa from the beginning, seemed charmed by the novelty. Marcus showed up, as Tessa had known he would, and spent the evening flirting cheerfully with a vampire who worked in Gavril's administration. "You've come a long way from spilling wine," he told Tessa during a quiet moment. "I really have." Tessa looked around the restaurant, at the mix of humans and vampires talking and laughing together, and felt something settle in her chest. Pride, maybe, or satisfaction. "Thank you, Marcus, for being a friend when I needed one." "Always." He hugged her carefully. She was still getting used to controlling her strength. "Besides, now I can say I knew the queen before she was queen. That's got to be worth something. Free coffee for life? I was thinking more like a small castle, but coffee works too." Tessa laughed, and across the room she caught Gavril's eye. He was watching her with an expression that made her heart, her still beating, vampire heart, skip. Love, yes, but also admiration, and something that looked like wonder. Later, when they were home and alone, Gavril pulled her close and said, "You're changing things. The court, the way we do business, everything. You know that, right? Is that bad?" "It's perfect." He kissed her, slow and deep. "You're perfect. I knew it the moment you spilled wine all over me and looked like your world was ending." "My world was ending," Tessa said. "Or at least the old one was. This new one is pretty good, though." "Just pretty good? Okay, it's amazing. You're amazing. We're amazing." She rested her forehead against his. "I love you. Forever." "Forever," Gavril agreed. "I'm holding you to that." Years passed, then decades. Tessa grew into her power and her role as queen with a grace that surprised everyone, including herself. She continued her work bridging the gap between vampires and the humans who existed in their world, establishing programs for fair treatment and compensation, creating spaces where the two groups could interact as equals. The court, initially resistant, slowly came around. It helped that Tessa had Gavril's unwavering support and that her initiatives actually worked, improving relations and reducing the kind of tensions that led to conflicts. Seraphine became an unexpected ally, her initial skepticism transforming into genuine respect. "You were right," she told Tessa one evening, 20 years after the wedding. "About all of it. The court needed someone like you, someone who remembered being human, being powerless. We'd forgotten what that was like." "I'm glad I could help," Tessa said. "You've done more than help. You've revolutionized our entire approach to human-vampire relations." Seraphine's smile was warm, nothing like the cold expression she'd worn when they first met. The king chose well. Tessa thought about that later, sitting in the study, their study with Gavril reading beside her. "Do you think we've made a difference?" she asked. Gavril looked up from his book. "I think you've made an extraordinary difference. The world we live in now is kinder, more just, and more hopeful than the one I inhabited before I met you. So yes, we've made a difference. You've made a difference." "We," Tessa corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." "Partners," Gavril said, reaching for her hand. "Partners," Tessa agreed. The decades continued to unfold. Tessa watched her human family age and pass her mother first, peaceful in her sleep at 87, then her brothers, both of whom lived long, full lives. It hurt, the way Gavril had warned her it would, but she had him to lean on, and centuries to remember them. Marcus lived to 93, sharp and sarcastic to the end. Tessa held his hand in the hospital and thanked him for being her friend when she needed it most. "Made life interesting," Marcus said, his voice weak but amused. "Not everyone can say they were friends with a vampire queen." "Not everyone deserves to," Tessa said, tears streaming down her face. "Don't cry for me. I had a good run." Marcus squeezed her hand with what strength he had left. "You take care of that king of yours, and keep making the world better. That's an order." "Yes, sir," Tessa whispered. After Marcus died, Tessa spent a week being quietly sad, and Gavril held her through all of it, offering comfort without trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. "This is the cost," he said gently. "This is what I warned you about." "I know," Tessa leaned into him. "And I'd still choose it. I'd choose you, choose this life, even knowing what it costs, because the love and the joy and the time we have together is worth the grief." "You're stronger than I was at your age," Gavril said. "It took me a century to come to that conclusion." "I have a good teacher," Tessa said, echoing what she'd told Seraphine decades ago. As the years turned into centuries, Tessa and Gavril built something that had seemed impossible at the start. A partnership of equals, a love that deepened instead of fading, a life full of purpose and meaning. They traveled the world together, saw civilizations rise and fall, adapted to changes that would have seemed like magic to Tessa's younger self. And through it all, they had each other. On their 100th anniversary, Gavril took Tessa back to the restaurant where they'd held that first revolutionary party. It was different now, updated and modernized, but still standing. "Do you remember?" he asked as they stood outside, watching the late-night crowd through the windows. "I remember everything," Tessa said. "The wine, the proposal, the way you laughed, the way you changed my entire life in one perfect, ridiculous moment. No regrets?" Tessa turned to look at him, this beautiful, ancient, impossible man who'd chosen her out of all the people in all the centuries. "Not one." Gavril smiled, and it was the same smile he'd given her that first night, full of genuine delight. Good, because I have plans for the next 100 years, and they all involve you. Only 100? Tessa teased. Let's start there and see where we end up. They walked into the restaurant hand in hand, ready for whatever came next, together. 50 years later, something unexpected happened. Tessa woke one evening with a strange feeling in her chest, a flutter that felt almost like... No, it wasn't possible. But the feeling persisted, and when she finally mentioned it to Gavril, he went very still. Describe it exactly, he said. Tessa did, watching his expression shift from confusion to wonder. I need to call someone, Gavril said, and spent the next hour on the phone with various vampire elders and medical experts. When he finally hung up, he looked stunned. What? Tessa demanded. What is it? It's rare, Gavril said slowly. Extraordinarily rare. But there have been documented cases of turned vampires who maintained enough of their human biology to conceive. Tessa's world tilted. Are you saying... I'm saying you might be pregnant, or the vampire equivalent. Gavril ran a hand through his white hair. We'll need to do tests to confirm, but the symptoms match. The tests confirmed it. Tessa was carrying a child, something that happened perhaps once in a millennium among vampires, and only to those who'd been turned rather than born. The vampire medical community was fascinated. Tessa was terrified and thrilled in equal measure. How is this possible? She asked the doctor, a gentle vampire named Elian who specialized in the rare intersection of vampire and human biology. We're not entirely sure, Elian admitted. The theory is that your turning was recent enough that some aspects of your human reproductive system remained viable. It's also possible that the emotional bond between you and His Majesty created conditions that allowed for conception. Honestly, this is miraculous territory. Is it safe? Gavril asked, his hand tight around Tessa's. We'll monitor carefully, but yes, I believe so. The pregnancy will be different from a human one faster. For one thing, probably only 4 to 5 months total. And the child will be unique, neither fully vampire nor human, but something new. Something new, Tessa repeated, resting a hand on her still flat stomach. I can work with that. The pregnancy was indeed different. Tessa found herself craving bizarre combinations of blood and human food, her body unable to quite decide what it was anymore. Gavril was alternately delighted and terrified, hovering like she might break while also treating her with a reverence that would have been annoying if it weren't so sweet. The court, when they announced it, reacted with shock and cautious joy. A royal child, especially one conceived so impossibly, was seen as a blessing and a sign of good fortune. 4.5 months after that first strange flutter, Tessa gave birth to a daughter. They named her Rosalind, and she was perfect. Pale like both her parents, with Gavril's dark eyes and Tessa's determined chin. She was born aware in a way human babies weren't, tracking movement from her first moments, and the vampire doctors declared her healthy and whole. She's beautiful, Gavril said, holding his daughter with a tenderness that made Tessa's heart ache. Absolutely beautiful. We made a person, Tessa said, exhausted and amazed. An impossible, miraculous person. You made a person. I just helped. Gavril looked at her with eyes full of wonder. You've given me everything, Tessa. Happiness, purpose, and now this. How can I ever repay that? Just love us, Tessa said simply. That's all I need. Always, Gavril promised. Rosalind grew quickly, a child of 2 worlds. She had vampire strength and speed, but also a warmth and vitality that was more human. She was curious about everything, fearless in a way that terrified her parents, and absolutely adored by the court. When she was 5, looking and acting more like a human 10-year-old due to her accelerated development, she asked Tessa about the story of how her parents met. Well, Tessa said, settling in to tell the tale. It started with a very fancy party and a very clumsy waitress. Rosalind listened with rapt attention, and when the story finished, she said, So you spilled wine on Papa and he fell in love with you? Something like that, Tessa said. That's silly, Rosalind declared, but also romantic. I want someone to fall in love with me like that someday." "Someday," Gavril said, appearing in the doorway. "But not for a very long time. You're not allowed to think about romance until you're at least 200. "Papa," Rosalind laughed. "That's forever." "Exactly." Gavril scooped her up, ignoring her protests. "Now I believe it's time for bed." As Gavril carried their daughter off to her room, Tessa sat back and marveled at the life they'd built. From a single moment of clumsiness and wine and unexpected laughter to this, a family, a purpose, a love that had lasted centuries and showed no signs of fading. It was impossible. It was miraculous. It was everything. And Tessa, who had once been just a tired waitress trying to make it through another shift, wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. Years continued to pass, marked now not just by the changing world, but by Rosalind's growth. She matured into a remarkable young woman, neither fully vampire nor human, but something beautiful and new. She had her mother's compassion and her father's strength, and she used both to make her own mark on the world. The night of Rosalind's 50th birthday, when she looked and acted like a human in her mid-20s, she announced that she wanted to continue her mother's work, bridging the human and vampire worlds. "Someone has to," she said at the small family celebration, "and who better than someone who's both?" Tessa felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm so proud of you." "I learned from the best," Rosalind said, hugging her mother tight. Gavril watched them with an expression of complete contentment, and later, when it was just the two of them again, he pulled Tessa close and said, "500 years ago I was alone. Powerful, yes. Respected, certainly, but utterly alone. And now look at what we have." "A family," Tessa said softly. "A real family." "Yes." Gavril kissed her forehead. "Thank you for spilling wine on me, for saying yes, for giving me this life. Thank you for everything." "Thank you for laughing," Tessa said, "and for seeing me when everyone else just saw the help. Thank you for choosing me." "I'd choose you in every lifetime," Gavril said. "In every possible version of this story. It was always going to be you." They stood together in the quiet of their home, 500 years from that first meeting, and Tessa thought about the impossible chain of events that had led them here. A charity banquet, a clumsy mistake, a vampire king who laughed instead of getting angry, a proposal that was half jest and all sincerity, a love that had grown from that strange beginning into something that spanned centuries. It shouldn't have worked. By all logical measures, it should have been a disaster. But logic, Tessa had learned, didn't account for the way two people could fit together perfectly despite being from different worlds. Logic didn't account for the way love could transform everything it touched. "What are you thinking?" Gavril asked. "I'm thinking that I'm the luckiest person, vampire, whatever I am, that I'm the luckiest being in the world." Tessa smiled up at him. "And I'm thinking that I can't wait to see what the next 100 years bring." "With you," Gavril said, "I suspect they'll be magnificent." "You keep saying that word, because you keep proving it true." Outside, the city hummed with life, human and vampire, mortal and immortal, all coexisting in the world that Tessa and Gavril had helped build. Inside, they held each other close and looked forward to the future they'd continue to build together. Forever wasn't just a promise anymore, it was their reality. And it was, as Gavril had known from the beginning, absolutely magnificent.